Sekai's life began on a stormy night, as if the heavens themselves wept in anticipation of the burdens she would carry. The winds howled and the rains lashed against the tin roofs of the small village, a place clinging stubbornly to its ancient beliefs and superstitions. She was just a child when tragedy first knocked on her door, claiming both her parents in a fatal car accident. In a single moment, her world shattered, leaving her adrift in a sea of grief she was too young to fully comprehend. Barely old enough to understand the weight of loss, Sekai was sent to live with her Aunt Lucia, a stern woman whose love was as scarce as rain in a drought. From the moment she arrived, it was clear that Sekai was not a welcomed guest but an unwanted burden. "Cursed," the neighbors whispered, their voices dripping with fear and superstition. To them, Sekai's presence brought calamity. Misfortunes seemed to follow her like a shadow. Livestock falling ill, crops withering before the harvest, and accidents that defied explanation. She became the village scapegoat, bearing the weight of their collective fears and failures. Her every step was met with wary glances, her every word dismissed as if her voice carried bad omens. In a small community bound tightly by tradition, Sekai's life became a series of quiet humiliations and unspoken accusations. She learned early on that her tears would bring no comfort, only more scorn. Despite her hardships, Sekai was a bright and curious girl, her mind a refuge from the harsh realities of her world. She found solace in books, their worn pages offering an escape into worlds far removed from her own. Every story she read kindled a spark of hope, a fleeting glimpse of a life beyond the narrow confines of her village. Her dream was to become a teacher, to one day bring light to the minds of other children like her. But dreams often clashed with reality, and in Sekai's world, hope was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the weight of her circumstances. It was during these difficult years that a compassionate teacher named Mr. D noticed her potential. He would slip her extra assignments and tutor her in secret after school hours, his voice a soothing balm to her wounded spirit. Under his guidance, Sekai began to flourish, her confidence growing with each passing lesson. For the first time, she felt seen, her mind a precious thing worth nurturing. Mr. D's encouragement lit a small flame of determination within her, a resolve to rise above the hardships that had defined her life thus far. But just as she began to blossom under his guidance, Mr. D left the village without warning. His departure felt like yet another betrayal, leaving Sekai adrift and heartbroken, her one source of hope extinguished. Life under Aunt Lucia's roof grew even harsher in the absence of Mr. D's quiet support. Sekai's days were filled with endless chores, her hands raw from scrubbing, her back aching from fetching water miles away. Each evening, as she collapsed onto her thin mat, exhaustion weighed heavily on her small frame, but her spirit refused to break entirely. She endured her aunt's cutting remarks, each word a dagger to her fragile self-esteem. But in the privacy of her thoughts, she clung stubbornly to the faint hope that one day her circumstances would change. She dreamed of a life where she could walk with her head held high, free from the village's damning whispers and the oppressive weight of her aunt's disdain. But hope was a dangerous thing in a world that seemed determined to crush her. The storm that marked Sekai's birth had never truly passed. It lingered, gathering strength, waiting to unleash its fury once more. Each passing day brought new challenges, each more grueling than the last, and yet Sekai's spirit, though battered, continued to fight for survival. Sekai's teenage years were marked by a deepening sense of isolation and betrayal. Her aunt, who had always been harsh, grew even more resentful as Sekai grew older. "You're just another mouth to feed," Aunt Lucia would often say, her voice sharp and cold. The love Sekai longed for was nowhere to be found, and the whispers of the villagers only grew louder. They watched her with suspicion, their eyes following her, as though she carried the weight of misfortune in every step. It was during this time that Sekai's life took another cruel turn. A distant relative, an older man named Munashe, who had once herded their cattle, began to visit Aunt Lucia's home more frequently. Munashe's visits seemed harmless at first, but soon his lingering looks and suggestive comments unsettled Sekai. One morning, Munashe asked her to help him take the cattle and goats to the grazing fields. Sekai hesitated but complied, not wanting to provoke his anger or her aunt's wrath. The walk to the fields was long, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and livestock. Munashe walked ahead, occasionally glancing back at Sekai with a smirk that made her skin crawl. When they reached a secluded part of the fields, he suddenly turned to her, his tone shifting from casual to menacing. "You think you're too good to speak to me, eh?" he sneered, stepping closer. Sekai's heart pounded as she backed away, her mind racing for an escape. Munashe grabbed her arm, his grip firm and unrelenting. His breath reeked of alcohol, and his voice was low and threatening as he whispered things that made her stomach churn. Sekai twisted and struggled, finally managing to break free and run as fast as her legs could carry her. When she returned home, shaken and breathless, Sekai knew she had to tell Aunt Lucia. Summoning all her courage, she recounted the incident, her voice trembling with fear and anger. But instead of finding protection, she was met with a stinging slap across her cheek. "You must have done something to provoke him," Aunt Lucia spat, her eyes blazing with fury. "You'll go and stay with him. He's family, and at least he'll take care of you." Forced to live under Munashe's roof, Sekai's world grew darker. Munashe's initial interest waned, replaced by outright hostility. He hurled insults at her, accusing her of bringing bad luck into his home. "You're just a cursed girl," he would sneer, his words dripping with venom. Sekai's days were spent in silence, her chores endless, her spirit further eroded by his cruel treatment. Nights were the worst, as the weight of her solitude pressed down on her, and the ache for kindness and safety became unbearable. In the rare moments of reprieve, Sekai's thoughts drifted to the village school she had left behind. She missed the classroom, the feel of chalk dust on her fingers, and the gentle encouragement of Mr. D. Her dreams of becoming a teacher seemed more distant than ever, like stars obscured by thick storm clouds. But even as the darkness consumed her, a flicker of defiance remained. She vowed silently to herself that one day she would escape this life, though she had no idea how. Her chance came in an unexpected way. After months of enduring Munashe's abuse, Sekai fell ill. Feverish and weak, she was no longer of any use to him, and he sent her back to Aunt Lucia without a word. Returning to her aunt's home felt like stepping back into a familiar nightmare, but Sekai's resolve to fight for a better life began to take root. She had survived one storm, and she knew more were to come. But deep down, she clung to the hope that she might one day find a place where she truly belonged. Sekai's return to Aunt Lucia's home was brief. Her health improved just enough for her aunt to declare her fit to work, and soon she was sent to the city to become a domestic worker. This was not a choice Sekai made willingly, but in Aunt Lucia's eyes, it was the only way for Sekai to earn her keep. The city was overwhelming. Tall buildings loomed over crowded streets, and the constant noise of cars and voices felt suffocating. For a village girl like Sekai, the city was a labyrinth, its twists and turns filled with dangers she did not yet understand. Her new employers, the Ndlovu family, lived in a small house tucked in a busy neighborhood. Sekai's tasks were clear: cook, clean, and care for the children. Though her body ached from the endless work, she found moments of solace in the children's laughter, even if their parents barely acknowledged her existence. It was not long before trouble found her again. Mr. Ndlovu, the unemployed husband, would linger around the house, his presence making Sekai uneasy. He would watch her as she worked, his eyes lingering too long, his comments laced with a familiarity that made her stomach turn. One day, he cornered her in the kitchen, his voice low and threatening. "If you don't do what I want, you won't get paid this month," he said, his eyes narrowing. Sekai's heart raced as she tried to think of a way to escape. She pushed past him and locked herself in the tiny room where she slept, her mind spinning with fear and anger. But the worst came when Sekai was unsuspectingly trapped. One evening, Mr. Ndlovu locked her in a room and violated her. Sekai's screams went unanswered in the empty house, and her tears stained the cold floor. It was at that moment she realized she could no longer stay. The next morning, her body bruised and her spirit shattered, she told Mrs. Ndlovu what had happened, hoping for even a shred of support. Instead, she was met with icy disbelief. "My husband would never do such a thing," Mrs. Ndlovu snapped. "You should be ashamed of yourself for lying." As if her words weren't cruel enough, Her wages were withheld that month, leaving Sekai with nothing. Gathering her few belongings, Sekai left quietly, her dignity in tatters and her heart heavy with despair. Out on the streets, Sekai felt the weight of the city press down on her. She wandered through the bustling markets and crowded alleys, searching for work, for shelter, for safety. Days turned into weeks, her body growing weaker with each passing day. She eventually found work in a small restaurant, washing dishes in exchange for meager pay and a corner to sleep in. The work was grueling, and the pay was barely enough to survive, but it was a temporary refuge from the storm of her life. It was here that she met an elderly woman named Gogo Tea, who often came to the restaurant for tea. Gogo Tea took a liking to Sekai, her warm smile a rare comfort in a world that had shown Sekai little kindness. "You're too young to carry so much sorrow," Gogo Tea said one day, her eyes filled with empathy. She would often slip Sekai small amounts of money or bring her food, acts of kindness that Sekai hadn't experienced in years. For a brief time, Gogo Tea's presence felt like a lifeline, a reminder that not all people were cruel. But the respite was short-lived. The restaurant closed down, leaving Sekai once again without work or shelter. Desperation clawed at her as she roamed the streets, her body thin and frail, her dreams crushed under the weight of survival. As she sat on the edge of the pavement one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sekai's resolve to keep going flickered like a dying flame. Her thoughts turned to the faces of the children she had cared for, to Mr. D's gentle encouragement, and to the fleeting kindness of Gogo Tea. Somehow, these memories kept her going, a fragile thread anchoring her to life. Sekai's journey through the city was one of survival, of finding slivers of light in a world that seemed determined to cast her in shadow. Though her body grew weaker and her spirit more fragile, she pressed on, carrying with her the quiet strength of someone who had weathered countless storms. Her fight was far from over, but deep down she still believed that someday she might finally find peace. As Sekai's health continued to decline, she became desperate for a solution. The city's chaos had taken its toll on her fragile body, and her soul bore the weight of years of sorrow. When she heard whispers about a local apostolic leader renowned for his healing and deliverance from curses, Sekai clung to the hope that perhaps he could bring her peace. The apostolic sect's gatherings were held in a dusty open field, where throngs of people knelt under the scorching sun, their prayers blending into a rhythmic hum that filled the air. The sect's chants were hypnotic, a blend of wails and fervent shouts that seemed to echo the collective desperation of those gathered. Women wept openly, their faces streaked with dust and tears, while men pounded the ground in rhythm with their prayers. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and incense, and the heat of the sun seemed to intensify the fervor of the faithful. Sekai felt both drawn to and overwhelmed by the intensity of the scene, her frail body trembling as she clung to the hope of salvation. The leader, Prophet Chuma, was a tall man with a commanding presence. He wore a white robe and carried a wooden staff, which he claimed was a conduit for divine power. "God's favor is upon me," he declared to the crowd, his voice booming with authority. Sekai, too weak to stand for long, knelt in the dirt, her hands clasped tightly as she silently begged for deliverance. Prophet Chuma called her forward during one of the gatherings, his piercing gaze settling on her frail figure. "The spirit of misfortune clings to you," he said, his tone grave. "But fear not, for God's power shall set you free." Sekai's heart leapt with hope as the crowd murmured in approval. She believed that this man, with his aura of divinity, could finally free her from the chains of her suffering. In the weeks that followed, Prophet Chuma summoned Sekai for private sessions, claiming that her case required special attention. He spoke of cleansing rituals and the need for complete obedience to divine instruction. Sekai, desperate to rid herself of the curse she believed plagued her, complied without question. But the private sessions soon turned sinister. One evening, under the guise of performing a sacred ritual, Prophet Chuma forced himself onto her, shattering the fragile hope she had placed in him. Sekai's cries for help were swallowed by the darkness of the small, dimly lit room. The violation left Sekai broken in ways she could not articulate. Her health deteriorated rapidly, and soon she discovered she was pregnant. The life growing within her felt like a cruel reminder of the betrayal she had suffered. The pregnancy further strained her fragile body, and Sekai's hope dwindled with each passing day. Alone and abandoned, she struggled to find the strength to carry on. The tragedy deepened when she lost the baby, her frail body unable to sustain the pregnancy. Grief engulfed her, and her once quiet resolve crumbled under the weight of despair. She had hoped that, despite the circumstances of its conception, the baby would be her own beacon of light in a world of darkness. She had imagined holding the child, feeling its tiny hands grasp hers, and for once, having something that was entirely hers. But with the loss, that fragile dream shattered. Sekai wept for the child, for the future she could not give, and for the cruel fate that seemed to strip her of every fleeting happiness. The people in the sect who had once welcomed her now avoided her, their whispers filled with judgment and disdain. "She brought this upon herself," they said, their words cutting deeper than any blade. Sekai's days grew darker, her body weaker, and her spirit almost extinguished. Reflecting on her life, she saw a chain of misfortunes stretching back to her earliest memories, orphaned young, exploited by those she should have trusted, and now betrayed by a man who claimed to be a servant of God. Sekai felt as though the universe had conspired against her. She often asked herself why she had ever been born, what purpose her existence served when every chapter of her life was marked by suffering. Each misfortune seemed to mock her, as if the world took pleasure in her pain. Each misstep, each heartbreak, had chipped away at her spirit until there was little left. She was tired, bone-deep weary of a life that offered no respite, and she was ready to give it all up. Summoning what strength she had left, she called for a friendly nurse who occasionally visited the area. When the nurse arrived, Sekai handed her a carefully folded letter, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please find my teacher, Mr. D," she pleaded, her eyes filled with urgency. "He was a teacher in the Gomo area. Make sure he gets this before my burial." The nurse, moved by the frail young woman's plea, promised to fulfill her last wish. Though her body succumbed to the weight of her suffering, Sekai's final act carried the power to shake the very foundation of the world that had failed her. The day of Sekai's funeral dawned with an unusual stillness, as though the earth itself paused to acknowledge her passing. The small village was cloaked in a solemn silence, broken only by the occasional cry of a mourning dove. Villagers, young and old, gathered under the shade of a large baobab tree, their faces etched with grief and curiosity. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wilted flowers, and even the wind seemed to whisper Sekai's name as it rustled through the leaves. Mothers clutched their children tightly, as if to shield them from the haunting legacy of Sekai's life. Fathers stood with their heads bowed, their silence a reflection of the shame that now gripped the village. Rumors of Sekai's tragic life and untimely death had spread like wildfire, and many had come not just to mourn, but to hear the words of the mysterious letter she had left behind. Mr. D, the teacher Sekai had revered so deeply, stood at the forefront of the crowd, his face a mask of sorrow and determination. He clutched the letter tightly in his hands, the edges worn from his anxious grip. The nurse who had delivered it to him had explained Sekai's final request, and now, with a heavy heart, he prepared to fulfill her dying wish. "Friends, family, and neighbors," Mr. D began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Today, we gather to bid farewell to Sekai, a young woman whose life was marked by unimaginable hardship. But before she left this world, Sekai asked me to share her story with you all, to give voice to the pain she carried, and to expose the truth she could no longer bear alone." He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, locking eyes with familiar faces that now appeared heavy with unease. "This is not an easy truth to hear," he warned, "but it is one that demands to be spoken." The crowd shifted uneasily, their murmurs blending into the rustling of leaves. Mr. D unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar yet heart-wrenching handwriting. "I was born into a world that seemed determined to break me," Mr. D read aloud, Sekai's words weaving a tapestry of suffering and resilience. Each word seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of a life that had fought desperately against the odds. Sekai's voice, though absent, felt alive through her written words, resonating deeply with those who listened. She spoke of her parents' untimely death, the cruelty of her aunt, the betrayal of a trusted relative, and the exploitation she faced in the city. Each revelation pierced the crowd like a dagger, their collective gasps a testament to the weight of her truth. When Mr. D reached the part detailing Prophet Chuma's betrayal, a stunned silence fell over the gathering. Sekai had laid bare the dark secrets of the man many had revered, exposing the predator who had cloaked himself in holiness. "He stole from me not just my trust, but the one light I thought I had left," the letter read. "I carried a child I hoped would bring me joy, but even that was taken from me by a cruel twist of fate." Tears streamed down the faces of many in the crowd, their sorrow mingling with anger and shame. Dee's voice faltered for a moment as he read the names of those who had wronged Sekai, each syllable a blow to the oppressive silence that had allowed such atrocities to thrive. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, some too stunned to move, while others clenched their fists in outrage. A few whispered prayers, their faith shaken by the revelations. To those who turned a blind eye, to those who whispered instead of acted, and to those who believed my pain was mine alone to bear, "You have blood on your hands," Sekai's letter concluded. "I leave you with this. My story will not die with me." Let it be a mirror to our society and a call to do better, to protect the vulnerable, and to break the cycle of silence. Her final plea echoed like a challenge, urging each person present to confront the harsh realities they had ignored for too long. "Will you let my suffering be in vain?" her words seemed to ask, pressing into the hearts of everyone gathered. As Mr. D folded the letter, the weight of Sekai's words hung heavily in the air. The crowd was left in stunned reflection, their hearts heavy with the realization of their collective complicity. Some wept openly, while others stared at the ground, their shame unspoken but palpable. The funeral ended not with the usual somber farewells, but with an unspoken resolve. Sekai's truth had sparked a fire in the hearts of those who had gathered, a fire that would not easily be extinguished. Her life, though fraught with pain, had sown the seeds of change, and her voice, though silenced in death, would echo for generations to come.